I'm Corey Owens, National Training Coordinator with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and I work with the Soil Plant Science Division, where I focus on partners training, which is what all you guys are here today. So excited to see everybody from around the country. We're thrilled to have you here to join us as we pull back the curtain on soil interpretations. Our featured speakers are Bob Dobos and Steve Campbell. Bob and Steve, if you are so inclined, please feel free to turn on your cameras. Bob Dobos works in Lincoln, Nebraska at the USDA NRCS's National Soil Survey Center, where he's a soil scientist for interpretations and focuses on using the soil survey database of the United States to explore the relationships between soil, site, and climatic characteristics and land uses. Bob's career has taken him to many places in the East, including Pennsylvania and Virginia, as well as Central and Southern Appalachia. Steve Campbell is a soil scientist with the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service as well. He sits on the core team at the West National Technology Support Center based in Portland, Oregon. He provides technical assistance and training on a variety of soil science related issues, such as using soils data for program delivery and interpretations to the Western states, including Alaska and the Pacific Islands. Steve's career has taken him to many places in the West, including Washington and Oregon, and now, of course, the entire Western region. Before I turn it over to Bob, I want to direct everyone to the chat where you can enter your questions and comments. I'll be monitoring the chat throughout the session. We can do questions if it makes sense during the presentations, but we also will have a Q&A session at the end. And of course, towards the end of the session, I'll be posting a form for your feedback to see how things went for you today, and also to ask what types of content you might be interested in for future partner seminars. So with that, I'm going to start. And I'm going to Bob, you are muted if you're right now.
All right, should be unmuted now, I think.
Yep, sounds good.
All righty. Let's see here. Let me share my screen if I can do such a thing as that. And I'd like to thank you for that introduction, Corey. It's always kind of sobering to hear that between Steve and I, we have pushing frighteningly hard on 100 years of experience with the agency. That's a little sobering, but that's okay. And thank you all for taking the time out of your busy days to sit in and listen and watch and maybe learn a little bit today. Hopefully, we'll learn some things about interpretations. And so that's what we're going to start right off the top. See, what's an interpretation? Then we're going to talk about soil and site properties. We'll talk a lot about those. You'll hear that quite a bit. And we'll talk about the modeling system. How does this thing work? Or what's it do? What's it look like? How does it do its magic? Then we'll, after having kind of a reductionist look at the thing, we'll stick the pieces back together again and see how it kind of works. And then I'd like to review a few interpretations case studies, and we'll look at how many interpretations are out there. And then finally, I will introduce to you all a methodology that how you can participate in the development of interpretations, which is a fairly new thing, and hopefully someone of you will be able to figure it out. So, what are interpretations? Interpretations are models which use soil and site properties to predict how a soil will respond to land use and management. I think they don't call them models because back when this stuff was being developed, interpretations, models were something little kids played with. And so we didn't want people to think of them as just toys. So we called them interpretations. That's a much more mature sounding word. And land use is an interesting concept. It can take on a variety of meanings. For example, Lee Burris is out there. He's interested in production agriculture with Iowa Corn Suitability Rating. I work at that stuff too with the National Commodity Crop Productivity Index. There's conservation practices can be a land use, habitat for a soil-borne pathogen. If you're in the Southwest, you've heard of valley fever, perhaps. Soil can be interpreted as a sink for atmospheric carbon. And of course, we can interpret soils for home site development. And then finally, at the end of the day, I think of interpretations as a species or entity, non-specific interaction with soil and landscapes. That's just my 50-cent phrase for describing what interpretations really boil down to.
Say, Bob, I'm not seeing your PowerPoint slides. Are other folks seeing them?
I'm seeing them. We're on the common interpretations slide.
Oh,
It says it's
sorry
sharing.
A lag.
No,
sorry
don't
for the
worry.
No, I
interruption.
think you're good. There was a little bit of a lag for me as well, Steve. So maybe it'll catch up here in just a sec.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank
Always
you.
good to
Thanks.
ask. Mhm.
Yeah, well, what, you know, especially when you have a troglodyte running the system that, you know, if it's got more than 2 keys, I have a difficult time. But the red line is around my PowerPoint screen, so I'm assuming it's going out onto the waves. So just a few common interpretations. We might not even think of them as interpretations, or land capability class and subclass. Hydrologic soil group, that's everybody's favorite. Wind erodibility index, KW and KF, those water erosion factors, and soil loss tolerance, you know, which is an extremely important interpretation. Let's see here. How can I get my pointer back in there? Okay. What's going on now?
The system seems to be running a little slow.
No, I just hadn't clicked in the screen to make it advance. So now we're all right. Interpretations following along are suitabilities and limitations for land use and our models that use soil property. See, I like to repeat this because there's some people out there that might still have the opportunity to work with soil properties. Soil property and site data to predict soil behavior under certain land uses. And lots of times we use outside research to determine which characteristics are important. So we do a lot of Google searching and Google Scholars and spend a lot of time on the internet reading journals and things like that just to get an idea of what soil and site properties and what levels, what magnitudes, what values are important. And each interpretation, each model uses a different set of soil and site properties. And even if they use the same ones, it would be different levels would be engaged. So we've been talking about soil and site properties. Well, some soil properties are measured in the lab, and you can see them there. Important things like bulk density, cation exchange, electrical conductivity, organic matter, organic carbon. A lot of things we observe in the field. We look at the slope, the surface stoniness, the vegetation. I don't have that listed on there, but the vegetation is important. Geographic information, geomorphic information, whether it's a water collecting slope or water spreading slope, what the parent material is, or how many layer cake parent materials we're looking at perhaps, or whether the thing ponds or floods, depth to saturation, depth to restriction, and lots of other things also we observe in the field, because it's one thing that soil scientists by and large do really well. We observe things. We might not always know what it means, but by golly, we can see things and write it down. And we have all this data. We've collected it. We've written it down someplace, perhaps, and it's stored in a database in tables and columns. And so we might have a database as one table, but it has a child table because the soil survey area is made up of map units. There can be hundreds of map units in a soil survey area. And so, you know, there's everything dealing with map unit itself is in the map unit table. But of course, the map unit also has children, and its children are components, soils. They can be, you know, soils that we all know and love, like Cecil and Appling and Tama, Houston Black, or it can be things like water and rock outcrop, things of that nature. And those component can have a lot of children, like somebody might not always think about restriction, kinds and the depths, hardness, the parent material, the layering of the parent materials, if there's more than one, the geomorphic things, aspects, whether it's a toe slope or a foot slope or a shoulder slope or a back slope, the shape of the landform. And the other child of the parent component would be the horizon tables. And the horizons also can have children, but I didn't want to belabor this slide that much. But what we're trying to do with this gross simplification of the database structure, if any of you have used NASIS, the National Soil Information System, the NASIS client, or if you've used Sergo products, then you'll know that this is a gross simplification of the soil survey database. But I just want you to get an idea of how complex the data structure is. And it's complex because the science and business of soils is also a very complex venture. And so it only makes sense that the database would be fairly complex as well. And so we have all this data. So what do we do with it? We have an automated system using what we call the interpretations generator, which lives inside the National Soil Survey Information or National Soil Information System. The part of it is the transactional soil survey database, which is kind of unfortunate because we can't run interpretations on official public-facing data that's run on. Instead, interpretations are run on the transactional database. What we use is a rule-based fuzzy logic system. And rule-based simply means that each property or soil attribute has a rule. Kind of, you might think of it as if this, then that, else something else. Fuzzy logic simply means that we'll talk more about that. But fuzzy logic seems to be appropriate in soils for a lot of reasons. Mostly its ability to handle vagueness and the imprecision of thresholds. And I'll probably say it more than one time, the data can be good to 3 decimal places. It's not necessarily, and hopefully it's not ever really, the data that's fuzzy. It's the thresholds that are fuzzy. And we'll get to that in more detail, painful detail later in a little bit. Fuzzy logic deals with the relative truthfulness of a statement and the degree of membership a soil component might have in a set of soils that are suited or limited for a land use. And so we might say it's absolutely true that a soil is too steep for no-till farming if the slope exceeds 20%. And I think most of you would agree with that. 20% slope, it's pretty steep for farming on. At what point is the slope, but is 15% too steep? Or maybe it's 12%, or maybe it's 12.5%. And you see, that's where the fuzziness comes in. It's that threshold. At what point is the slope not a limitation? Is it 5%? Is it 4.5? Is it 3.25? Or is it 3.333 repeating decimal ad infinitum? That's where the fuzziness of fuzzy logic comes in. It's not the data, hopefully, but it's the thresholds. It's the judgment. It's the person factor that comes into it to decide at a point what a slope is limited or not limited, or conversely, a soil property is limited, not limiting or not limiting, or suited or not suited. So we're just going to take a few minutes. I'm kind of belaboring the fuzzy logic, I think, because it's it's for a lot of us, it's not intuitive. It's not something we think about explicitly, but it's something we think about implicitly all the time, I think. The Boolean logic accounts for only true or false. It's black or white. But a soil property at some level is or is not a member of the set of limiting features at some level. So you might say 35% slope is too steep for, running a bulldozer. And so, from 34, say, but still you have that ambiguity, 34 to 35. Well, maybe it should be 36. But at some place you have to draw the line and say it's absolutely true that this is too steep. And another funny thing about soils is that many statements about soils are both false and true to some degree. Is this soil too wet to build a house with a basement? Well, maybe. And that's the kind of responses or kind of thought things that fuzzy logic can help us to work with. So it allows us to quantify how true or false a statement is. And generally, we have a panel of experts that sets the limits of truthfulness or falsehood. And fuzzy logic is helping us to deal with vagueness and imprecision and still communicate information. And that's one of the important features of interpretations, that we're trying to communicate what this soil, how the soil will support or not support what we want to do, how it will support some kind of an ecosystem, how it will support some kind of a fungus or a tree or a bacteria or any of those things. So in the old class system, the members of the set are well defined in classical set theory. Membership of the set's not difficult. It's black or white. The set of even counting numbers between 1 and 11. It's just there's only so many of them. And it's a pretty defined set. Natural systems can be vague, and we need to be able to use phrases, or we use phrases like somewhat and maybe. And the soil scientist's favorite, it depends, to describe how these natural systems work. And what's cool about fuzzy logic is it captures those thought processes and puts them into a formal mathematical framework that's being represented by the partial membership in sets. And it helps us to communicate suitability or limitations of a soil much more precisely than we could with the old, three stoplight system with red, green, or yellow. What the fuzzy logic is doing, for the most part, is giving us a nice gradation in that yellow, that no man's land, if you will, of suitability or limitation. So the approach that we use in this, how do we implement this fuzzy logic in the soil survey database system in the NRCS interpretation approach? First off, we have to kind of, set the stage. That's not the right word. But to let us know up front that we have two styles of interpretations. There's limitation style and there's suitability style. Historically, we used a lot of limitation style, and there's still a lot of limitations out there. If soil is limited for land use, if it's too steep, it's limited if it's too wet. In a limitation style, a soil property is not limiting if its membership value is 0. It has 0 in term, for limitation. And 1 indicates the property is limiting. And so the slope of 30% might have a 1, whereas a 5 might have a 0 for a limitation style interpretation. And then just to make things really confusing, we have another style, a suitability style, in which a property is suited if its membership value is 1 and not suited if the membership value is 0. As I mentioned, traditionally we've used a lot of limitation style, but I have an awful hard time using a limitation style interpretation for a productivity index, saying, yeah, this is a good soil, it's a 0. And that doesn't make sense. Even if you're taking a number times 100 to kind of normalize the score, it's still a 0. So I like much better to use a suitability style interpretation, so that, my better soils are a number closer to 1, or if I multiply it by 100, or closer to 100. And that's something that, kind of have to always keep in mind, whether we're dealing with a suitability style interpretation or limitation style interpretation. So, get that being said, that soil or site property that we want to look at is extracted from the database. It's a little bit of structured query language, SQL. Sometimes we use a little bit of syntax to brush it up a little bit to make it more useful. Sometimes we put a bunch of properties together. Excuse me. My allergies have just been driving me crazy lately. And yeah. Okay. So the data can be used as it is. Sometimes we just use it directly from the database, like the slope, representative slope, 5%. We use it just like that. If we're looking at available water storage, then we do some calculations to calculate the available water storage from the available water holding capacity of each layer above a restriction. So we have a little piece of data. So we've gone out into the database. We have a pH 5.6 or we have a slope 8. That doesn't tell us a whole lot unless we have some context to it. And so then we put some context to it. So we have that little bit of data. It's given to the evaluation and it's mapped against a membership function. And if membership functions are the heart or one of the hearts of fuzzy logic, because the membership function allows us to assess the degree of truthfulness of the statement. So you might say a soil is limited for a baseball field if the slope is greater than 6% or 6%. We see a 6% gives us 0.8 of a fuzzy number or relative value or membership value. A lot of different things that these numbers are called depending on which literature you're looking at. Everything has to be confusing. We can't have anything that's just nice, clean cut. I don't know why that is. So the evaluation produces a numerical result from 0 to 1. And 1 can be limiting if it's a limitation style interpretation, or 1 can be well suited if it's a suitability style interpretation. And that number, that relative effect number, will be sent to the rule, where the rule adds some verbiage to it. But first off, I want to take a little bit of a deeper dive into these membership functions because they're pretty cool things. So if this graph that you're looking at is a membership function for depth to a restrictive layer in its membership value. So we're looking at 160 centimeters as being that maps up to a 1 for the membership value. So that's pretty good supposition that we're looking at a suitability style interpretation, because it's not often that the deeper soil is more limited than a shallower soil, or is less suitable than a shallower soil. And we see that we have a restrictive layer coming in at 50 centimeters or so. That maps out to about a 0, or not a poorly suited or not suited membership value of 0. And everything from 150 to 50 to 150 is called the fuzzy space, and that's where we'll get a membership value to describe the degree of membership in that set of suitable soil depths. Yeah. So soil can be, if it's 100 centimeters deep to a restriction, we're looking at about a half. It's about a 0.5 member of the set of suited soils. And we can manipulate that number more as we go through the system. So there's different membership functions, three basics really. More is better, and this is a suitability style thought train, suitability style interpretation. More is better because who doesn't want to have more organic carbon in their soil, right? Less is better. We get electrical conductivity much above 8, then crop productivity really falls off because of osmotic effects. And then you can have a middle is better kind of a relationship. And the classical one for that is pH with a nice peak around 6.5 for corn. And so the shape of the curve is based on observations, natural laws, or just hunches, because a sigmoidal curve looks like it's describing a natural system. Because we kind of think of them that way. A lot of times with the pH curve, I'll have values that I can plot out to make a curve that's just specialized for a particular crop, which shows, of course, or indicates that the thresholds and the peaks are use dependent. Because I think shortleaf pine has a pH optimum of around 6, but longleaf pine it's down around 5. The longleaf pine will tolerate more acidic of soils. And if you look at these, to use these, we really need continuous variables rather than crisp or character data. So in other words, we try to avoid working with a texture class, silty clay loam, and prefer instead to work with the sand, silt, and clay percentages to kind of wring the effects out of them, out of each size separate rather than trying to look at a class. Okay, so we have these membership values that were derived, mapped against the membership function for whatever soil property we're looking at or site property. And what we call a base rule takes that number from the evaluation. And a rule is just a little logic diagram that describes a relationship between evaluations and the base rules that make up a parent rule. See, we're talking about there's generally more than one soil or site attribute that has an effect on land use for whatever land use might be. So we have different, more than one base rule, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But the real magic of a base rule is it's applying the rating class name. We're kind of defuzzifying it so that we have a little bit more information to convey. So if the membership value came back as 1, that maps over to a rating class name of well suited. And if it came in at 0.75, well, the upper boundary is 0.999, so 0.75 is going to be suited. And similarly, if it came in at 0.3, that's be somewhat suited. But if the membership function comes in at 0, then it's not suited. Just to kind of give an idea of how the numbers are shaking out and trying to impress upon ourselves that these rating values are not probabilities. They are degrees of membership. So, as I was alluding to earlier, most interpretations have more than one base rule. Well, pretty much all of them have more than 3 base rules because you have slope, water table, flooding. How about shrink, swell, electrical conductivity, or pH, or liquid limit. Just all kinds of base rules out there. And those base rules are fed in or assembled in a parent rule, And for a limitation style interpretation, using an OR operator, because OR operator takes the highest of the membership values from the base rules. So it's taking the highest one is making that, or meaning that's going to be the most limited. Conversely, an AND operator in a suitability style interpretation will report the lowest membership value as being the least suited. And that kind of semantic gyrations kind of makes your head hurt sometimes. So how do we assemble the pieces? How do we go from somebody saying, hey, I need an interpretation for fill in the blank. I need an interpretation for sugar maples, or I need an interpretation for longleaf pine, or how about coccidioides, valley fever? How about corn productivity? So how do you go from a land use problem to that interpretation, to a model? And so we have a team of subject matter experts, ideally, considering the soil and site attributes that may affect the land use, and we assemble those characteristics and their degree of limitation in a matrix called a criteria table that looks like this, sort of. So this is a criteria table example, kind of abbreviated for shortleaf pine. And some of the things we looked at were depth of saturation, the pH, the depth of restriction, the mean annual air temperature, flooding and ponding, mean annual precipitation, and a whole raft of other soil and site attributes that went into the shortleaf pine interpretation. And so our panel of experts says, okay, if the depth saturation is greater than 24 inches, that's probably okay. It's probably well suited for longleaf or shortleaf pine. If it's less than 7, it's probably not suited because it's too wet. And so for H, we got a nice well-suited range around 4 to 6. But if it's less than 4, you're probably looking at aluminum toxicity. Or if it's greater than 5, you might be looking at micronutrient unavailability. Bioavailability might be going down. The depth of restriction, greater than 150, that's good to go. But less than 10 centimeters, you're probably looking at rooting volume limitations, just the degree of the amount of nutrients that can be found, water that can be found, and stability as well. You'd be more susceptible to being blown over. And so also a mean annual air temperature, you can kind of get an idea of the heat requirement or frost damage or heat damage too. Flooding and ponding, mean annual precipitation. The tree needs enough water to be able to grow, to be able to compete with other trees, and just a sufficient amount of water for growth. And so, here we want to show you just one little basic, simple property script where we're executing SQL and we're looking at the restriction depth low, restriction depth high, and the restriction depth RV. These things come out of the component table, joined to the component restrictions table. Then we just sort by the horizon depth top, or the restriction depth top, and a little bit of aggregation. We're looking at the first instance of each variable, low, high, and RV. And that's a nice, simple property script, but you can get the idea that we have a lot of these things going into the database and extracting data, manipulating data, and funneling it into evaluations. And so the membership function for restriction depth looks a little crazy. That's okay. Most soils, when we're down here in the below 10, we try not to, we don't even think of those as being all that suitable for timber production. And just there's a nice gentle slope getting up to 150 centimeters because, is 100 really that much better than 120 or worse than 120? Is 80 that much better than 60? Well, we know that 20 is a lot better than 0. But is 160 or 150 that much better than 140? And we're trying to quantify that ambiguity a little bit. Because most of the time when we're looking at things, there aren't hard, solid rules, except for perhaps from the endpoint, the end members. So there's a lot of, I don't know what you want to call it. I don't want to say conjecture, a lot of hypothesis in interpretations. That's a better word than conjecture. So we had this evaluation here. So for say 100 centimeters, we're looking at about a 0.75. And that number is sent, is in this evaluation. This hedge looks at it and says, okay, this number is present, so it's not a null one. So we're good there. But what if I don't have a restriction depth in my soil? What if there's no restriction? Then null or says, oh, there's no restriction. If the restriction property script is sending me a null, then that's okay, because I know that if I have null for restriction, that's good, or that's okay. We'll send it a 1. And this is a base rule that's giving us the soil depth suited, somewhat suited, not suited, and ready class upper boundaries for a particular soil property, in this case, depth of restriction. And I know you can't read this on the left-hand side, but it's there really just to show you how many things are considered in an interpretation, how many attributes are considered. And so over on the right-hand side, we see a table of all the attributes that are on the left. Well, drainage class, not subaqueous. Heating, aspect, clay content, drainage, flooding. Where are we on the hill slope? What's the linear extensibility like? The mean annual air temperature and precipitation, ponding, pH, rock fragment content, soil depth, and surface fragment cover. And that just seems like there's more than that in that interpretation, but that's what came out when I ran the report. And so we have these interpretations, and you might ask yourself, what are they good for? Are they useful at all? Is there any value that people can get out of them? And so there's this disease called coccidioidomycosis, also known as valley fever. Somehow we didn't get that V capitalized. Oh well, next time. And since the distribution of the organisms is really climate sensitive, temperature and rainfall, changes in climate should cause changes in the spatial distribution. So, we'll get these things. You're looking at the little graph on the right. So we might actually expand the range. And indeed, we have expanded the range of the valley fever organisms, Emitus and Posidacea coccidioides. They live in conditions that can be pretty well predicted and precisely mapped using the soil survey database. And so, well, that's good. What's that all about? And so there's a lot of incidences in the literature where they talk about valley fever, coccidioidomycosis. In one article that caught my eye was large-scale land development, fugitive dust, and increased coccidioidomycosis incidence in the Antelope Valley of California. So they put in solar farms and raised a bunch of dust, and people got sick. And it's a kind of a complex life cycle of coccidioides in the lower right-hand image. And the upper right-hand image kind of looks at like the life zone where you might find this fungus, kind of dry, arid stuff. But what's interesting is if they'd have had a map, they would have known that, hey, we're putting these soil panels in places that are suitable for this fungus to grow. And you can see that, the solar panels written on the graphic. You can see the solar panels are these square things. A lot of them are laying in the places where it's suitable habitat, and some of them are in the not suitable habitat. So if they had known that they were building these things in the well-suited habitat, then perhaps they could have did some dust mitigation or huh, okay, am I back?
You're back.
Where did it stop?
Dust mitigation, if they'd had the maps to do dust mitigation.
Oh, okay. So I didn't ramble on too long before I realized that, hey,
No,
okay, good.
nope, you're good. Hmm.
So I'm going to just back up one slide, just to make sure. Oh, over here. And so, yeah, we talked about if the installers had prior knowledge. Of course, the article didn't come out until 2021, and this article's from 2014. So I was a little late on the draw with this one. But again, if you're out digging around making a bunch of dust, I think the take home message is if you're out in an area where there's suitable habitat for this fungus, you have to be careful about breathing in the dust. And this happens, if you're riding a four-wheeler. BLM is really interested in this because a lot of the coccidioides habitat is BLM land. And it's supposed to be open for public recreation, and almost everything the public does raises dust. And so it'd be really good to be able to have predictions of where the fungus is going to live and have trails go around those areas and not be in the suitable habitats. So that's valley fever. I used to think nobody ever
Hey,
died
Bob,
because, yes.
you had a quick question in the chat. I don't know if you want to address it now, but it's about the color ramps, how they choose red versus green. For this one, red seems at first glance don't build here, but it's the
Yeah,
opposite.
well, Jason, we're looking at suitability for the fungus, and the fungus likes the green places and doesn't like the red places. And that's an interesting question that you bring up because, we say it's suitable. Well, who's it good for? Is it good for me? It's certainly not good for me. It's good for the fungus. And unfortunately, all the Webster survey system doesn't work that way. I'm not sure. I'm not clever enough to be able to tell the programmers to say, hey, for this one, make the green places where it's not suitable. Because all the mapping that I do for these things would be just as Jason's mentioning, the red places would be green on my maps and the green places would be red, showing that they're dangerous places. So you have to, keep your eyes open about what the things are trying to tell us. That's a good question. Another case study, longleaf pine and gopher tortoises. They seem to both do well on deep, well-drained soils in warm climates. The gopher tortoise is an herbivore, and likes leafy plants to eat. And in a properly managed ecosystem, the longleaf pine tolerates fire which gets rid of the woody shrubs. And so fire turns out to be essential for both species. And of course, we have interpretations for both of them. And so let's look at a place. But first off, we're going to look at the range of these things. This is Little's range of longleaf pine on the left, and the gopher tortoise range, I can't remember where I got this map, on the right. And you see their ranges look pretty, a lot of overlap, huh? The gopher tortoise doesn't get into western Louisiana or East Texas and doesn't get as far north as North Carolina or Virginia. But other than that, we got really tight overlap between longleaf pine and gopher tortoise. So we start, maybe they evolved together. Then we look at the map and we see the green stuff. Green map is well suited for longleaf pine on the left. The green is highly suited for gopher tortoise on the right. And we see a really good agreement between especially the well-suited habitat for the tree and the tortoise. And I wouldn't be surprised if we don't do some tweaking on the longleaf pine model and knock these greener areas on the left-hand side to red anyways. And then we'll have almost a one-to-one relationship between the suitability for gopher tortoise and the suitability for longleaf pine. So I thought that was a pretty cool relationship, that we can wrap that out and see it and work with it using the interpretations for both species. And then we have subaqueous soils. Yeah, I don't know how many of you have dealt with subaqueous soils. But in the coastal area, the soil doesn't stop at the water's edge. There are vascular plants rooted in the substrate, in the soil underwater. And so if they're less than about 5 meters deep, and that's the depth that we talk about soil underwater, is limited by the turbidity of the water, because if they're vascular plants, they need to have sunlight to work. And so we have to have the clarity of water enough for the plants to have their photosynthesis. And these soils are important features of the landscape, both economically and ecologically. And so we're going with an economics on this one. Want to talk about the mooring of boats, because you don't have a dock necessarily made out to park your boat at. You have a mooring out in the bay somewhere. And sometimes, as we found out in the past few weeks, we have storms on the coast that can blow ships around pretty well, boats around pretty well. And so we use different anchoring systems based on the soil properties of the subaqueous soil. What they call a soft bottom, there's silty or clayey stuff, that allows for the use of a mushroom anchor. And just think of a mushroom anchor. If you ever walk through the mud, you get mud about up to your ankles or maybe your calves, and try to pull your foot out of the mud, your shoe stays in the mud and your foot comes up. And that's the suction kind of action that's working for a mushroom anchor. And those can be fairly small and relatively inexpensive. You have a hard bottom, gravels and sands, then the only way to anchor your boat, to moor your boat, is a sheer ballast systems, a great big chunk of concrete that's a lot heavier and a lot harder to work with. And so we like to be able to find places where it's soft and we can use a mushroom anchor. But what's kind of neat then, of course, is a subaqueous soil that works for one might not be suitable for the other. And so this is, I can't remember, this is Rhode Island or maybe Connecticut. And we see the green places that are good, not limited for deadweight anchor, turn out to be the red areas for the mushroom anchor. And the ones that are red for the deadweight anchor turn out to be, not limited for the mushroom anchor. So I thought that was kind of a cool relationship there. Just seeing how you talk about it, is this soil good for something? And you have to ask, well, good for what? because the soil can be good for one thing, work well for one land use and then not work very well at all for another land use. It's all based on the context. So I'm going to let me back up this page here, and we'll turn it over to back up a page. I want to turn it over to Steve for a little while here, if that's all right. And I'm going to be quiet and get a drink of water and some coffee and let my voice cool down a little bit, Steve. Thank you for.
As long as you advance the slides for me, Bob, I'll be
okay.
In good shape.
All righty, I'll do that. Are you ready?
Yeah, all set to go. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so in this section, we're going to talk about what I call major categories of soil interpretations in the National Soil Information System, or NRCS. And as you can see on the slide, there are currently 119 national interpretations. Another name for these in NRCS are what we call primary rules. And these interpretations are automatically included every year when we do our soil survey area refresh, soil survey data refresh. And that happens every year where the new data becomes available to the public on October 1. And when that happens, then all these interpretations, these national interpretations, are available to the public. One of the things I wanted to mention about this slide, you'll see these are screen captures out of the National Soil Information System, and you'll see that the interpretations start with a 3-letter prefix. For instance, you see a number that start with AWM. These are related to some kind of waste management, agricultural waste management, or municipal waste, those types of things. You'll see on the right-hand side, there's a number of interpretations that start out with SOH. So these are soil health related interpretations. For instance, like organic matter depletion, soil surface sealing, susceptibility to compaction. Those are soil health related interpretations. And then you'll see a number of interpretations on the lower right start out with WMS. And those are related to water management systems and structures, including different types of irrigation systems. So just interpretations related to water management. And so those again are the national interpretations. And almost every year, and maybe Bob might want to comment on this, there's usually a few new national interpretations that are added each year. And so the list continues to grow each year. Okay, Bob, I'm ready for the next slide. So this next major category are what we call regional interpretations. There are currently 66 regional interpretations that are set to ready to use in the National Soil Information System. And these interpretations are not applicable in many cases nationwide, but they're more applicable to certain geographic regions. And for each one of the states, the state soil scientist or their assigned person that does the soil survey data refresh decides which one of these regional interpretations to include during the annual soil survey data refresh. And again, you can see many of these start out with a 3-letter prefix. And I just wanted to mention a few of these. You'll see a number of them that start out with BLM. And these were created by a team of soil scientists and rangeland management specialists with the Bureau of Land Management and the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And they work together to develop all these interpretations that are designed to assist with rangeland management practices. You also see on the upper right a bunch of interpretations that start out with FOR. These relate to forest management type interpretations. Bob already mentioned the shortleaf pine suitability, which is a regional interpretation since that tree species only grows in a certain part of the United States, for example. And also on the lower right, you see all the interpretations that start out with SAS. That stands for subaqueous soils, like the interpretation that Bob just demonstrated earlier in the mooring anchor interpretations. So those are the regional interpretations. And I'm ready for the next slide, Bob. So the last category are what we call state interpretations. And in preparation for this presentation, I queried our what's called our SOL Data Mart to find all the different state interpretations that are being used across the country. And there's currently 505 unique SOL interpretations currently available on Web SOL Survey and what we call SURGO downloads. I don't know if the SURGO acronym we may not have mentioned before, but it stands for SOL Survey Geographic, and that's our most detailed SOL data product, SOL survey data product. And again, these are organized by what we call SOL survey regional offices. And so the left screen capture is from the Alaska SOL survey area region, and you can see again a number of engineering. The ones that start out with ENG are engineering related interpretations, and in Alaska they have a lot of soils with very high organic matter. They have permafrost, so they've developed a lot of local interpretations to deal with unique properties in Alaska. And then you can also see some that start out with CPI, which stands for Crop Productivity Index. For example, there's one for potatoes productivity index, small grains productivity index. And then on the right, you'll see a bunch of interpretations developed by the South Central Regional Office, which is headquartered in Temple, Texas. And a lot of them, so they start out, a lot of those interpretations start out with AGR, which stands for agronomic interpretations related to crop production primarily. Another thing I wanted to mention about these interpretations, these state interpretations, is even though they may have been developed for a particular state initially, they can be used by any state that finds them applicable. An example I could share with you is that I helped the state of Washington develop some nitrate leaching potential soil interpretations. And we did extensive testing in Washington. And so after that, I worked with a number of the other states in the West, and we tested it in their states, and it was working well in their states as well. So they just started to use it. And now the state of Massachusetts is also using an interpretation that was originally developed for Washington. So again, even though an interpretation was initially developed for a particular state, any state that finds it applicable to their state can also use it in their annual SOL survey data refresh, and it becomes available to the public. So that's my last slide, Bob. I'll turn it back over to you. Thanks.
All righty, Steve. Thank you. Yeah. So we have a lot of tools on our toolbox. And it's just a matter of, in a lot of cases, knowing they're there and how to use them, and knowing that a torque wrench doesn't make a very good hammer, and a hammer makes an even worse torque wrench. So I mentioned earlier how the public, the partners, how can you all participate in what we're doing? And the interpretations branch, meaning me, I maintain a web page where anyone can see the interpretations that are being developed, which ones are underdeveloped or recently been made available on Web Soil Survey. And on the right-hand panel, you see cacao growing in Puerto Rico. And so what I'm going to do, I think I'm going to run through these, and then I'm going to come back to this one and catch this hot link. So here's how you can do it. And that hot link will take you to the Soil and Plant Science Division Interpretations Testing Worksite. And these are under development, and you have to think about a little bit of caution because there's not an entirely one-to-one relationship between the NASA's client database, the transactional database, and the public-facing database. So I wouldn't use these for programs or anything where a lot of money is going to be exchanged. But they're useful for getting an idea of what we're up to. And so you can look at the Interpretations Focus Team site, or you can look at all of these reports that you can run. You need a SOL survey area symbol. And so there's two different ways of getting that. A lot of times there's a one-to-one relationship between the SOL survey area symbol and like the state FIPS code. But a lot of states, hardly have any soil survey areas that are, they use the state FIPS, this county FIPS code for a soil survey area ID. Then we can also go to box where the survey data is stored. And so, all right, let's go back up and see if we can make this work. I'm always a little bit hesitant about using live demonstrations because, as you saw earlier, I got dropped off the call for a while. And usually when you're trying to do something live with a big audience, your computer knows it and can feel attention to the keyboard and is more likely to to, to freeze up than at any other time. But here we go. So here it is. Soil and Plant Science Division was testing. So we can get soil survey areas by state, and we'll be crazy. We'll put in California % and see that, well, yeah, well, they have a lot of soil survey areas, and that's all right. But most of us are kind of interested in a county. So I'm looking for Kern County, California. Well, there it is there. Oops, here it is here. But the point is that a lot of soil survey areas can end up being parts of one or more counties. And we'd kind of like, I think most people would prefer to know where their county is and what soil survey areas are associated with it. So we can go over here and we'll put in our California again. Submit that. And we see, well, we're mentioned Kern County. We'll see Kern County shows up in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different soil survey areas impinge on Kern County, California. So you have to kind of know where you are in Kern County to be able to decide which soil survey area ID you want to use in the report matrix. So that's kind of what we're looking at there. But we were looking at Hawaii. So let's look at Hawaii because that's what's in the PowerPoint. So look at HI % for a wild card. And we see there's this many soil survey areas that are in Hawaii. And the soil survey area symbol is the string that we need in the queries. So we want the Big Island. I think that's HI 801. So we can just take and we'll copy it because I'm lazy and don't like to type. So I'll copy that. And so then, let's see here. What do I want to look at? All kinds of different interpretations. I love coffee. So let's do a coffee suitability index for soil survey area. So we can click on this and it'll ask us for the soil survey area symbol. And I can paste in my Hawaii 801 and submit that. And eventually, see, this is much like I was saying. I don't know what happened. It probably just hasn't finished yet, I guess. Huh. Well, maybe just plain old isn't going to run because you never know what can happen. So I think Hawaii is small enough. I can put in HI %. Then we can look at coffee that way. Unless I have the No, I copied and pasted that soil survey area symbol, so that should have been right. Yeah, HI 801. Okay. So it's running. That's one of the limitations of this website is you can't run a great big area. Uh, um, I think all the counties or all the soil survey areas out there will run, but you can't run a whole state except for maybe like Delaware. And we're seeing that even Hawaii's taking a little bit of effort. Yeah. Well, this is why I don't like to use live demonstrations. So we've done this. Um, we have our list of soil survey area symbols. We put in Hawaii into that one. Hawaii asterisk percent sign, and we see the soil survey area symbols for Hawaii. And those the soil survey area symbol is the piece of text that we want to put into the link. So this here should take us back to that. Okay, it was HI 801. And it's running. The donut's going around. It's spinning circles. But if there's a lot of bandwidth being tied up by a lot of different people out across the country, and then our ability to run reports gets to be a little bit limited. So I don't have enough patience to watch that. So that particular script I was running is going to make a mapping export. And what's a mapping export? That's something that has, it's mapping it aggregated to the map unit level. And the MU key is in the report outputs. And so the MU key is what you use to tie the tabular data that we get out of this system to the spatial data, which we picked up from Box. And here's how that would eventually end up. Oh, it's HI 701. Maybe 801 was a bad soil survey area. We'll go back to that. You learn something every day in this job. Well, no, that's not where this is. Anyways. Yeah, something didn't work quite right. Well, we'll try it again. We'll go back to this. Yeah, let's try this again.
Bob, some folks are following the link I sent and getting things to load. So
Okay, good.
yeah.
Yeah, the 801 should have worked. That's the one that's the island of Hawaii. So
I think there's a message in the chat saying that like maybe there was a space. So it's like space.
Extraneous space in there. Yeah, that's the problem when you copy and paste sometimes. Yeah. All right. Well, we've got plantons to run. I didn't know I ran plantons. Anyways. Oh, that's California, soil survey areas. Okay. Oh, here it ran. I was just not patient enough for it. A lot of 99s. 99 is the convention that I use for things that are null. So these were a lot of lava flows. They came up null. Kona is a good coffee soil, makes Kona coffee. So it's coming up 0.77. That's pretty good. I just wasn't patient enough with it. But anyways, that's actually fairly straightforward if you're patient, which I'm not. Okay, let's zip back here. So that's kind of what that looked like, or should have looked like. Here's, it ran each of the whole island or the whole state and made a map using ArcPro, and each of these panels is a different layout. And I have my legend up there, and yeah, kind of a nice looking map. You can see on the big island on the western edge, the Kona belt, that nice green streak. On the western edge. So that's kind of things that a person can do if they want to test these things, just out of curiosity. Maybe it's like a Friday afternoon where it's too late to start anything and too early to go home. You might look at some of these things and just get an idea of whether or not you think that interpretation really is working okay, or if it's not working all right. You could suggest improvements, and I would appreciate your input and your intellect on helping to tweak and to balance and to tune these interpretations. And so you can always get a hold of me with the website or the email address. And I think that's the last slide. So thanks for listening. If you have questions, I'll gladly entertain them.
Any questions for Bob or Steve? And I'll also flag up, I put our feedback form in the chat today. So if you could, our peak number was 122 people. I would love as many people as possible. It's a short couple-minute form on your experience day with the seminar. But any questions for Bob or Steve? Feel free to raise your hand or put them in the chat. All right, with that, I'm going to stop our recording. And let's all give a round of applause if you're